Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, that was a short-lived break. Last week at this time, we were talking about how the legislature was taking time off for the summer, all back to their constituencies to find out what was going on in their neighborhoods. We promised that we would be still broadcasting the podcast here. Dave Trafford with Keith Leslie, John Wright. On the Ledge is the podcast, and they're back in their chairs and all set for a late night gathering into Saturday morning. Keith Leslie, do you recall ever having a question period on a Saturday at Queen's Park?
No, I do not, as a matter of fact. In over 40 years of watching Queen's Park, I'm sure there probably was one at some time, some back-to-work order on some TTC strike or teacher strike or something. But no, it's very, very unusual. I also never recall an overnight sitting, although we've had one before in the Ford government when they tried this same sort of thing with the Toronto City Council, where he again threatened to use a notwithstanding clause. This time, an urgent recall of the legislature in the summer to use a notwithstanding clause to pass, of all things, an Election Finances Reform Act, which I think most people could care less about. You know, there's just not a lot of interest in it. But to see this government, the minute the courts rule against it, not even to consider appealing to the next level of court, no, right away, we're going to use a notwithstanding clause, which, let's face it, it has never, ever been used by an Ontario government. It's never been used by the federal government. And with good reason. It's supposed to be the last option, the last resort. And it's the first thing they're going to without even, trying to, rewrite the legislation or appeal to the next level of court. Boom, we were calling the legislature, we're calling the House, bring the legislation back with Section 33, the notwithstanding clause in there. Why? What's the urgency? You would think if the House was being called urgent, it would be something to do with the pandemic or perhaps something to do with the long-term care home situation. But no, election finance reform. So this seems very self-serving on the part of the government, and I think will upset a lot of people, this first use of the notwithstanding clause when it seems totally unnecessary, at least not, it shouldn't be the first option the government considers, and it has been. But on the other hand, it doesn't appear that there's a huge public interest in that from what I'm hearing from you fellows.
Yeah, it's John. I had Paul Callander on the radio on Thursday morning on More in the Morning, and he is the House leader for the Conservatives, and he was justifying why they wanted to go with the notwithstanding clause. A couple of reasons he points out. He said that the judge in this case didn't just say that the particular restriction on financing campaign or during the campaign was unconstitutional. He blew out the entire law. So there's no law in place right now. So that was their sense of urgency. We got to get a law in place because here we are, we're already inside the window. And the other side of it was they had determined that 12 months was a more appropriate time for this restricted spending. And I asked him, well, why is 12 months more appropriate than 6 months? What was wrong with 6 months? And I asked him 3 times. He would not bite on it. He wouldn't answer it. So it's not like there wasn't restrictions already in place.
This is where the judge called them out. This is what the judge practically laughed at them at this. He said, you sent the same experts here that defended the 6-month period when it was challenged in 2017. They come back here, the same experts, to testify that 12 months is better. So that's why it blew the whole lot. The judge was literally laughing at them. He says, this is unconstitutional all the way around. You're violating everyone's rights. You need to redo this in a way that's a minimal impact on people's rights and freedoms. So I think that the government really blew it here. They got greedy. They had a 6-month window that was now law and it had been upheld, which restricted the third parties to advertising their $600,000 worth of stuff within that 6 months. They tried to make it 12 months, which is a long way out from an election, seemingly very self-serving for the government. And now what do we have? A 28-day limit. So it was blown out, yes, but there's still a 28 days. So within the 28 days of the campaign next May, there will be a spending limit, whether this goes through or not. But of course, we have a majority government, so this is going to go through. It will be the new law. But it seems very self-serving on the part of the Ford government. Remember, it also doubles the political contribution limits, which is the other side of that legislation.
So for
it
all
also doubles.
So for all the smoke and the fire around this, though, John, and I heard people at Queen's Park getting upset about it. The opposition's calling it horrifying. All of these issues that you would expect a response in terms of the notwithstanding clause. This is getting actually zero traction. I mean, just listening to people respond on the radio shows over the last couple of days, the general public don't really give a rat's rectum that they're using the Notwithstanding Clause. And I think that the issue at hand, the whole idea around campaign ads and financing this, that, and the other thing, way above people's attention span right now.
Well, just sit anybody down beside you and say, do you know what open patios are for the first time after the pandemic versus notwithstanding? Okay, there you go. That conversation's over. I mean, notwithstanding, most people don't even know what that means. And of course, Keith, it is absolutely self-serving. But I mean, quietly, I'm sure the Liberals probably, if they were in the chair, would do the same thing if they had the opportunity to do so.
Well, they did under Wynne.
Yeah, but
right?
They were kicked and screaming doing it.
But look, I'm not going to defend the government on this because it's purely political. There are going to be a lot of people who, in this kind of new post-pandemic timeframe, want to remind people of what the government did or didn't do. But I mean, to say that this is taking away the individual rights of people to protest is a bit of a big stretch. On principle, yes, 6 months to a year, maybe 6 months would have been better, and we would have had a more combative kind of time frame, and that's good for democracy. Who knows? But in terms of engaging people to oppose this, I just don't feel it. I don't see it. And as you're right, at the end of the day, the government's got the majority. It's going to be done. Like, I can't see it changing.
Well, and the other side of this is I just don't think that people are generally concerned about the fairness of elections here. I think that was the whole thing that they're piggybacking on, the idea, we don't want other voices coming in here. And they started throwing around the phrases that we heard so much around the U.S. election back in November. I think people are smarter than that, generally speaking.
Apparently, Ontario is the province that has the most, and it's not surprising given the population, has the most third-party advertising during elections than any other province. And in fact, it's the only province where it's measured in the millions and millions of dollars. But we should also look, why are the Conservatives doing this? I know the working families and the other teacher union-backed groups that, they always advertise heavily against the progressive Conservatives. But Ontario Proud, which is developers and contractors that were backing the PCs and attacking the Liberals, they spent more in 2018 than the working families did. So why did the field need to be leveled here? I don't think we're facing what they are in the United States. The government's talking about we want to prevent super PACs. There are no super PACs here. I mean, there's nothing even close to that. These unions, the government said the legislation would prevent collusion amongst them. That meant they didn't want them sharing the same vendors and suppliers. Collusion? I mean, there's very limited resources. $600,000 doesn't go a long way in buying media time, whether it's over 6 months or 12 months. It just doesn't go a long way. So there was no huge conspiracy here. And I think, as Dave said, people are smart enough to know when they're being pushed with stuff online that's just so far off the beam, it's clearly partisan and an ad, and even though it's presented as news, people can read the difference. And people know when they're being spun and when they're hearing the real stuff. I think Canadians are just generally more smarter and more engaged electorate than Americans.
I think that when the public hears politicians talking about this, and civil liberties organizations and others, about this kind of restriction on elections, all they hear is Charlie Brown's teacher talking.
Yeah.
It's just not there. Secondly, of course they spun it that way. Of course both parties are going to say that. But the bottom line is this. You can't have big fat unions, and I say that because Sam Hammond and those guys are down their throats every day, or God bless Doris Greenspan, but she's out there with the nurses union and doing this. The problem is that the public doesn't like those guys either. Like they don't like the unions always doing this and always in their face. So it's kind of like going, well, you're shutting down our rights, and it's kind of like, well, who the hell cares? So the bottom line is this. Elections are won in fractions of the population. In order to get a majority government, you have to have about 37% of the vote in the province of Ontario, and Doug Ford got 40 last time out. So he can wake up every morning and have 60%, maybe even 62 to 65% hate his guts every morning and still get a government. So I think at this stage, you juxtapose an interesting constitutional debate versus a patio and a beer, and I think you're just going to get people walking by.
But if you're on that patio and, the patio's just open, you're there and you're okay, you don't want to talk about the pandemic, but geez, mom died in the nursing home and the COVID ran right through that thing. You can't help talk about it. We're not going to be able to avoid it. And, they just, it's just wrong.
But let me ask this, because we're probably looking at this through the wrong end of the telescope. We're looking at it as if this is the beginning of the campaign. The real leather hitting the road has to happen in the last 60 days before a campaign. There's a 28-day window, Keith, you point out, for a reason. So I can only see, okay, they're going to be able to yell and scream all they want, but now they've got $600,000 to spend anytime they want within that 12-month period.
But it's a finite amount of time, like airtime that's available, first of all. So they can't, it wouldn't really be fair. And what if, I know we talked about the big fat unions and the developers and contractors. What about the families of long-term care victims who are really outraged about the fact that they can't sue, they can't launch a class action suit, this government passed protection? What if they want to get together and advertise the heck out of this, and they want to do it for more than 28 days? So they are ordinary people whose voices are being silenced. It's not just the big guys at the unions and the big developers. There are ordinary groups that want to get their say out as well, and they are being affected by this.
But I don't disagree with you. But I just think that it's not going to have the traction that maybe others think it should.
So let's look at numbers that do and will have traction. And I think while all of this was going on in the legislature and, we were being distracted by that, a couple of other things are happening. First, to your point, John, we were getting ready to open up the province and allowing this step one and people back to patios and doing business. I talked to Tom Mahalik on the radio on Friday, and he is a clothier here in Toronto. And he has just, over the last number of months, normally upbeat, optimistic contributor. I mean, he is a leader in his community. He just sounded despondent every time I talked to him for about 3 months straight. Today, I talked to him on the radio, and he is just beside himself. The idea that he can have a 15% capacity in his store, he is reborn. And I don't think we can underestimate the value of that optimism and how it splashes on this government of the day, one way or the other. So the second thing is, we also had modeling numbers presented this week that suggested in the best case scenario, we'd have rolling averages around 615 over a 7-day period. And that's viewed as good news. So there's a bunch of things that are all sort of falling into place here that distract from all of the down in the weeds constitutional this, that, and the other thing that's going on in the House. Outside, I think there are a whole bunch of things that are conspiring to allow the government to get off the hook on these things. And you know what? We're so freaking exhausted from all this bullshit. Just give me something that I can hang on to. I can go and do some retail therapy. I can buy a beer and watch the soccer game at at a pub. Those are the things that I think are mattering. And I think that's really going to be reflected in the coming weeks and months.
I don't disagree. I think people are looking forward. They want to get away from, you say, the stuff that's in the weeds. Something that happened interesting this week, and it seemed to be played fairly straight. The Education Minister, Stephen Lecce, revealed a new grade 9 math curriculum is going to come in September, and was met, as far as I can see, with just general good reception, no heavy partisan stuff, no attacks from the union. It was a nice, normal announcement, and people seem to think, yeah, we needed that. That hasn't been done since 2005. We haven't updated the curriculum, put in some coding. Just a nice, normal announcement. So people, I think, are absolutely looking forward to that kind of thing. There wasn't even the reflexive comment, Keith. Well, what the hell took you so long? I mean, it was actually a mature conversation. People just accepted it as it was. I still think that, despite our best intentions and people being fed up with it, when we get to the patio or anywhere else, we're going to be able to have a beer or two or have a cocktail, things are going to come up. And I think in particular, still right now, the one that haunts the government this week is the second doses for the AstraZeneca people. What the heck? Why are they sticking to that? And this is what people aren't forgetting. And this is what we've all had to, go through the process here. And the ones that did what they were told to do, stepped up first, are now being told to stand at the back of the line. And that should be addressed. I really think it should. Well,
I talked to one of our medical correspondents on the radio this week, and I asked him about that because it's all over the text message boards and so on. Why are we treated as second-class citizens? And he said, it's the science. The science says AstraZeneca is optimum if you wait 12 weeks between the two doses. Leave it there. Now, where they run into trouble is that other jurisdictions have gone outside the science and decided that the mRNA vaccines are okay in a shorter period of time, and that they're going to shorten it. But we have criticized this crew up one side, down the other, inside and out, without any kind of varnish on any of it, because they didn't listen to the science table. John, right now they're listening to science. I don't think we can criticize them for this.
I think there's a couple of things at play here. And I think it's even demonstrated in the fact that you and I and Keith sat on this podcast for literally months saying that we should be sending in first doses better to the hotspots in Brampton and places like that for these frontline workers. When in fact it took, the mayor to come out just recently and say, we need to have more hotspot vaccinations over here. And lo and behold, the bombers are dropping, their payloads over there today. So there's a response rate. Look, I think the real issue here is that everything the government's dealt with in the last 14 months or so has had to do with COVID. There's only been one political party out there. It's called the COVID party. And if it's entwined with COVID, which people know a hell of a lot about, they talk about this all the time with their families and their friends and everybody, and are as knowledgeable as the politician, more knowledgeable sometimes, and even, I would argue, some of the science table people. The fact is that some of these new announcements have nothing to do with COVID. And you're not seeing that. You're right. He stood up the other day, Minister Lecce, and he goes, we're getting rid of this streaming nonsense. We're going to have a math curriculum. There you go. Crickets. You would have had people at somebody would have at least been at the barricades, even if they didn't believe in being at the barricades, yelling and saying, you're changing something and you didn't consult parents and you did nothing. And the same thing with, going back to the ledge, the notwithstanding clause. It's like, has it got anything to do with COVID? Sorry, going to the patio. So there's something else going on here. And I do think it's not contrived by the government to get away with this and have figured this out. I just think people are absolutely exhausted. And I think, secondly, it's the only issue that matters to them. That's it. So, but Keith, I want to make one point, just one point on you, because I think that on the long-term care stuff, I think people are not going to forget. People, you say people don't have a long memory. You're absolutely right. There are families that were affected by what happened, and people who are scared about the long-term care issues and things like that. I actually think that it's going to be a bit indelible, that people won't, and they already have figured out that if they were badly affected by it, this government's not going to get their vote at all.
I did want to point out just my experience in Nova Scotia, because I had the AstraZeneca shot first here, and when they did it, they gave me that day, the day they booked that shot, they gave me the date 12 weeks out, or 16. Anyway, mid-July was when I was supposed to have it. This week, I got an email. Your second dose of AstraZeneca is still scheduled for mid-July if you want to take that. If you'd like one of the mRNA vaccines, you can move it up, and here's the selection dates. And I was able to move it up for 2 weeks from now. All done in one email they sent me, and there was actually a separate link if I wanted to go to a drive-through vaccine clinic. Just easy peasy, simple as pie, and done. And I ran into my brother. He said, yeah, I got the email, same thing. They're booked the same day I was, and yet they had a different vaccine earlier on. So it's just taking the vaccine supply, gauging how they have it, selecting the age groups, and just sending out emails from one central spot. I know it's a much smaller population, but it still could have been scaled up, I think, to work in Ontario without this phone call. I got a phone call from a pharmacy yesterday telling me I hadn't called them. They just called me and said, you left us a voicemail. I said, no, they were one off in the number. They're trying, so can you imagine how many wrong numbers? They're just dialing nonstop. There's no need for all that. It really could have been simpler.
Well, the idea, though, that each region, we were talking about this morning, each region is in a different stage of reopening, however dire it may be. I know Manitoba's still having some struggles, but every region is looking at how to do this, and every region has its own criteria, and they use their own labels, and they use their own, phrasing around, well, are we in phase one, or are we in step one, or what are we? And the idea around can we use AstraZeneca and mRNA, and do we shorten the period? Well, BC says so, and Atlantic Canada says so. We've all got different criteria. It only speaks to the fact, and we have said this before, we need one throat to choke in situations like this. We need a national strategy that says, here are the guidelines for first dose, second dose behavior. Here's guidelines around masks. Here's guidelines around education. Here's guidelines around long-term care. If we end up coming up with a patchwork of planning after all of this, we're going to be probably in worse situation than we were before this pandemic hit, because there still will be no cohesion. There still will be no sense of a plan when we're hit again, John, by the next pandemic or whatever happens.
Yeah, I mean, we've got, that we're going to have inquiries and reviews. We know that there's going to have lots of recommendations for exactly what you've talked about, more national strategies or sharing of information and all that sort of stuff. So, and I hope it ends up happening and that we're better equipped for the next time. I think where my mind is actually at right now is about 4 weeks from now. Because if there's anything that the governments and everybody else are going to want to know, is that there's a rake in the grass and it's called the Delta. There's a variant Delta there. And if everybody goes out this weekend and they're on the beach and everybody's getting 10 people together and stuff like that, yeah, we're at 688. But what happens 2.5 weeks from now when all of a sudden we've got 1,200, 1,300, 1,500 or more? Like this is the real test. This is where, I've got my double dose. You don't have your double dose, but we can get together and we're going to try this. And it's going to be the true test of the science versus what it is. And we all know that the Delta has got even, more virulence, even if you've got double dosed. So I think that the politicians should be a little bit on eggshells, because if they have to pull back again, I can't imagine what people's reaction is going to be. But the second thing to the Ford government, and maybe to others too, this is the first time they're going to be able to take a break. And my question is, okay, so when are you going to turn the page on the cabinet? When are we going to start, hearing that there's new people getting in place and you're going to turn the page? I don't know when it's going to happen, but I know it's got to happen.
Yeah, I talked to Tim Hudak about that this week, and given his experience as a former leader of the PC, and he said, there's no question that is being considered right now. They're drawing up the list of who's and should be where, and he says there's no surprise at all. There will be a serious shuffle in the cabinet. So, again, as we kind of move this thing forward, the other thing you talk about, though, John, is worrying about the variant. I talked to Dr. Lawrence Lowe. He's the Chief Medical Officer of Health of Peel Region. He said very specifically, we are reopening, so do not be worried when we see an increase in cases. That's going to happen. So let's be ready for that. Let's not panic around it. And that was, to me, Keith, the overriding message behind the modeling. This is not a doomsday scenario. This is not the disaster truck off the cliff that we were talking about back in February. Do we still have work to do? Yeah. And when Steiny Brown is the guy framing it that way, I take some solace from that.
I think that's why the government got in a bit of trouble with the keeping the schools closed, because the same advice was there. Yes, there will be an increase in cases, but it's not catastrophic at this point. We are equipped to handle it. The system is more than ready for an increase. But yeah, the minute you reopen, whether it's schools or patios or whatever we're going to do, there will be an increase in cases. To John's point, will they be the Delta variant, and how virulent will it be? How widespread will it be? Because boy, if there's a fourth wave, despite everyone's desire and pressure on the government to reopen, we'll still blame them if there is a fourth wave, especially if it's this Delta variant. It's pretty scary. So everyone has to tread cautiously, but I thought the modeling was exactly what we wanted to hear. Yes, there will be increases in cases. It's bound to happen. We know this, but it's manageable. And I think that alone, because as you say, earlier on in the spring, that wasn't the message we were getting. You're getting an increase in cases, and it's going to lead to disaster. Our system could collapse, overwhelmed. It didn't happen. And this time, they're not even warning of that as being the issue. We can handle it. So positive news.
So in the polling that I released this week, there's a few things that I think are important to note. Number one, I track constantly how the governments across the country are perceived in handling the pandemic. And it's absolutely clear that the Ford government, remember that time when everybody was screaming and yelling, and then he goes to his mother's place and has to stay out of sight for a period of time because he's been exposed, and it's the best thing that ever happened to him politically, because they tanked. They went to 39% in terms of how many people thought they were doing a good job. And that's been resuscitated. I mean, the strict communications, the discipline of how they went about responding to that with the premier not in there. I mean, it's all optics and stuff, but people settled down. Okay, so that was the first thing. But, and then we have 69% who agreed that punting the school year to the end, right now, get lost, and we'll go to in-class in September. 69% 49% of people agreed with that. 58%, in fact, gives good thumbs up to Dr. David Williams. I mean, there's some report cards to be handed out. But what I thought was the most interesting question, that didn't get much play, was I asked the people of Ontario, look, you have a chance right now to turn the clock back. Turn it back. You know everything about COVID. So you could pick any political party, including the incumbent, to do it all over again. So let's do it. Okay, so what would you pick? 42% picked the Conservative government to do it all over again, and roughly splitting 25, 26 or so the other side for the Liberals and the New Democrats. And I just thought, even after all of this, again, I go back to this, the fractions of what it takes to get elected. There's a core of people who believe that the competence level, regardless of this government, was in place. But it also demonstrates what I've been saying, and that is 58% of people can wake up every morning and think that this government is the worst thing that ever existed, and they can still, barnstorm across the province and get a lot of support. So there's something there, and especially with Mr. Del Duca, which we'll spend some time on, I hope, at some point, who's just, you just see him on the Twitter account and nowhere else. There's nothing going on there. So there is no real opposition at this moment. And even Andrea Horwath is not picking up a lot of support. I think it's going to be different by the end of the summer. Again, I think people are going to change their mindset. They're going to get back into a different routine and different things. And that's when it's going to matter more.
Well, I think it's going to matter in about an hour or so from now, when everybody gathers on the patios on College Street in Little Italy and starts to watch the European Football Championships, and that will change our perspective entirely. All right, you guys, the marching orders are get out to the patio and have a beer. Keith Leslie, John Wright, I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics Podcast. It's an eye contact podcast.